Welcome to East Europe's Minorities in a Century of Change, a podcast on the history of minority experiences in Central and Eastern Europe during the 20th century. This series is part of the Institute of Historical Research's centennial commemorations, Our Century, Looking Back, Thinking Forward, and has been organized by the BASEES Study Group for Minority History. It was made possible through the help and support of the British Association of Slavonic and East European Studies and the Stanley Burton Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Leicester. The study group is a forum devoted to researching minorities and the national and regional histories of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe and promoting closely scholarly collaborations. For more information, please visit our website at studygroupforminorityhistory.com. Today, we'll be talking with Ágoston Berecz, author of The Politics of Early Language Teaching, Hungarians in the Primary Schools of the Late Dual Monarchy, and Empty Signs, Historical Imaginaries, the Entangled Nationalization of Names and Naming in a Late-Habsburg Borderland. He was born in Budapest, studied Hungarian and Portuguese at ELTE, did graduate work at CEU in Budapest, and has since held visiting professorships at both CEU and ELTE. He has also been a Max Weber Fellow under Peter Judson in Florence, and has held fellowships at the Center for Advanced Study in Sofia, and is currently a fellow at the Imre Kertész Kolleg Jena. Ágoston, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in this area of history?
Well, as you mentioned, I was originally trained as a historian. So I think it was around 1999 that I got interested in social linguistics from a very critical standpoint. That is how standard languages are made. So how it is constructed, all these ideological and power relations that are behind the language that most people today speak, language and dialect and so on. And that was on a summer language school in Santiago de Compostela that we were supposed to study standard Gallego, and I got overwhelmed with all this politicized context of what standard Gallego is and why we should learn it, like this very artificially codified language, and you can also call a very late case of nation building. So then I got interested in literature of nation building, nationalism, and also aspects of sociolinguistics.
I'm interested you talk about the standard Gallego as being artificially codified, because it implies that there are some languages that are naturally codified.
Yes. That's a good point. Yes, but you see, it is a bit still different, because there is very, very deliberate engineering behind what they have been doing, like very deliberate.
As opposed to all those people where there's no deliberate engineering. I think it's interesting how people use the word artificial as a term of delegitimization. You say, oh, you know, I mean, I haven't studied Gallego, but I've been interested in Macedonian and in Slovak. And so the Bulgarians will say of literary Macedonian or sort of North Macedonian, this is some sort of artificial language, as opposed to other languages that are natural. I mean, but it's interesting because it's a slander that works. People do take that badly when they hear that their language is artificial.
Yeah, and that is part of the problem area that I got interested in, like the discourses about the artificiality of a newly designed language, like, for example, like 19th century Hungarians used it to delegitimize these younger standards that were popping up next to them, and they were defying the supremacy of Hungarian. And then they tried to show that that basic is not one language, because like an ordinary peasant from this and that valley won't understand it, and they won't understand each other. So it's better to actually replace it with the, sometimes they embarked on this project, like with Banat Bulgarian, for example. Like, they try to prevent them from getting nationalized in an Illyrian, original in the Illyrian direction, and then they actually sponsored. So it was the Roman Catholic Diocese of Jana Temesvár, who originally sponsored engineering a separate Banat Bulgarian language for them. So, but the discourse on this is much wider. So that was part of the area that I got originally interested in.
Well, both of your two studies are analyzing different aspects of the late Habsburg Hungarian nation building policy. But I, as reading those studies, was particularly struck by your contribution to the study of Magyarization. So how did you get to be so interested in Magyarization?
Oh, okay. Let's put aside the concept for the moment, because I don't think I'm fully on board with the label. And also part of my work, my second, well, with the first book, you can claim that because my first book was about how the Hungarian state tried to get schools, minority schools, but also establishing its own network of schools, how to get them to teach Hungarian, how they try to achieve that the citizenry learns Hungarian to a satisfying level. Like very few people would today call it, like would have probably that is a very basic level of nation building that we now take it for granted that you are supposed to learn the dominant language or the language of the state. But in the 19th century, that was part of what many contemporaries refer to as Magyarization. So I would translate it as nation building. But with my second book, I think it is broader in scope. So there are some aspects of Magyarizing policies, state policies. There are more like grassroots level practices, policies, but part of it is about changing perceptions of, for example, of names of all kinds, like how people started to project ideological, historical imaginaries into names along this project, like process of becoming national. And national in various directions. So these are competing national projects that I focus on. So apart from the Hungarian, also the Romanian, and to some extent German.
Well, I was interested to hear you talk about, today we would take it for granted that you learn the state language, because in the context of the Habsburg monarchy, it's not entirely clear that Magyar should be the state language. In a sense, you could argue that it should be German that is the state language.
Mm-hmm. Well, my latest project has been on languages in the administration, in all spheres of official life. And there were much debate about the introduction of jury trials in the 1880s. And then the problem suddenly emerged. How can we get those juries to actually understand each other and understand the accused? Like these were criminal trials. And then just for the sake of argument, there was one very influential Hungarian theorist of nation building, Gustav Beksic, who came up with this just as a provocative like idea, like if we really, because he tried to argue against jury trials, and as an ad absurdum argument, he actually argued that in Transylvania, for example, we should then have these jury trials in Romanian, because that is the that is the language that is most universally spoken. And,
which is
yeah,
obviously self-evidently absurd for his Hungarian colleagues.
Yeah, it was really for the sake of being absurd. But yes, in Hungary, and that was part of the original like constitutional change, like that Transylvania became part of Hungary. That came in two stages. First, for a brief moment in '48, and then Hungarians never accepted that was again a separate Grand Principality. And then at the time of the Ausgleich, but yes, in the Austrian part of the monarchy, there was no state language. You don't need a state language.
I guess I mean, I'm thinking about some of my own research about the varieties used in state administration. And it's got me thinking that maybe the concept of the state language needs to be disambiguated, because the language of the courts and the language of the army and the language of the provincial bureaucracy and the language of the regional bureaucracy, they may not be the same. They can be different.
Yes, and in language policy studies, I think state language is not a widely used term and not very well defined. They rather speak about recognized languages. So those varieties that actually in practice are used in this or that sphere of the administrative life.
I think it's important, though, also to contrast not only the terminology used by the sociolinguists or scholars, but also the languages used by the actors themselves. So I know that in the Habsburg monarchy there was a lot of talk about the Landessprachen or landesüblichen Sprachen, and I think the leap from Landessprache to Staatssprache is not so great.
Was there a Staatssprache?
I know I've seen discussions we should have a Staatssprache for Cisleithania, and I'm pretty sure the Hungarians came up with a Alami or Alamnyelv. Of course, you'll have to correct my not very good Hungarian.
Yes, you're entirely right. That was the term used, like Alamnyelv. That is a state language. And they argued that it is in everybody's interest to learn the state language. So in a sense, this kind of spreading the knowledge of the state was couched as an emancipatory project.
But I suppose if we get back to the idea that we must disaggregate the concept of an Alamnyelv and see how the state works in its different institutions, the state in a provincial, if the state is embodied in the mayoral police force or the local post office in some small town in the Carpathians, then the language of that police station or that post office might not be the official Alamnyelv. That might be Romanian or Slovak or anything else.
There were very serious discussions also in the Cisleithanian part of the Habsburg monarchy about how we can efficiently manage to conduct multilingual policies. And that I think that is an actual genuine question to raise. With the postal service, certainly. Although I know that in dualist Hungary there were local postmasters who didn't know Hungarian, but they were required to know. And from the very early, from the first years, and it was not even disputed, the language of post stamps became Hungarian.
I imagine that if you work in the post office, even if you do speak Romanian or Slovak, you can learn the 20 words necessary to read the postage stamps.
That was very, very, very funny, actually, with the delivery guys. It was mostly guys who were often illiterate. So actually it was regulated, and by law they were supposed to know how to read, but very often they didn't. And so the way they delivered their the letters and parcels and whatever, so the postmaster tried to give them directions, and And while a Hungarian state was trying to enforce these laws that even the delivery people should know Hungarian, because otherwise how would they deliver those parcels? But in a village where like there are like a couple of hundred people, that might not cause an actual problem.
Well, this leads to, one of the things I like most about your research. Your work has such incredible detail on provincial actors. In your book on naming and names, for example, you talk about the National Communal Registry Board, which I assume is based in Budapest and is sort of the central actor. But you also talk about a school inspector in Bihar, an archpriest in the Banat, all sorts of provincial noblemen and school boards, and all sorts of local actors who are doing something maybe not what the center in Budapest would like. How did you find all this material about these provincial actors?
Oh, you're very nice to tell this, because and actually I find this fascinating that so many reviews actually reviewers have the impression that I work with a wealth of archival material, and I have quite the opposite impression. Well, to begin with, this is a very, to me, it looked like a promising field, because one reason people have never actually done this topic, like nationalizing policies in dualist Hungary, because the archival evidence was all over the place, and then there was also this language barrier that much of the paper trail is in Hungarian, and it is stored in like Romania, Slovakia, and then the locals should be able to decipher this handwriting in Hungarian, so they don't do that. They basically, for their own purposes, they use the contemporary Romanian or Slovak press to describe what happened. But the situation is not very rosy, as I found out, because like the Romanian state archives are not so much interested in preserving this material. They took them over at a very late stage from various institutions who themselves didn't preserve this old material from the Hungarian time. So it is very, very patchy. And what happened in Hungary is even worse, because in 1956, when there was the revolution, and those government archives from the dualist times perished, like most of them. You mentioned the National Registry Board. That is quite unique in the sense that it was kept in the statistical offices. So that is one font that survived intact, and that is from one source, and this covers one like operation. That operation was this re-baptizing of locality names in Hungary, and it also contains all the material that they received from the local governments. It's actually, I think it is very important what you said, that the state, what you call the state, we understand it as a monolith, but it has evolved so much in the 19th century. There were often like institutions with competing interests involved. So local governments, very often they were interested in continuing with the use of the local language. So they were promoting the local language. Sometimes also counties, some counties. In Transylvania, these are the Transylvanian Saxon counties who went on like doing everything on a trilingual basis. While the Hungarian state promoted the exclusive use of Hungarian. So this is just a digression. But you have this, and you have some, for example, right now I'm working on internal colonization projects. And for that, I have the whole material preserved, because for some reason it belonged to the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Agriculture archives have survived. But otherwise, I'm in not much less fortunate situation than many of my social historian friends are in terms of archives, and that is also why I'm doing my research in a rather unconventional way. So in a scattershot, hit and miss way, because when you go out to the archives and you get funding for doing research in like all over Romania, like on this side of the Carpathian, like former Transylvania at large, you should be familiar with the structure of the original archives, so how they were structured, and you're not. and it is also described in a very hit and miss, random way. So chances are you won't find what you are looking for, but you will find exciting material that you can use for another project. So
it is interesting, actually, how much history is shaped by which archival funds happen to survive. I know when I was first in graduate school, I was doing some research on Poland, and I was very struck by how many people writing about Poland in the 19th century were writing about Galicia. You don't find so many books about Volhynia. It's Galicia, Galicia, Galicia. And then at some point I realized that's because the archives on Galicia are held in beautiful Vienna and everything is well organized and it's all very clean and nice. And if you're going to research Volhynia, you have to go to Ukraine. And in the Soviet period, that was very difficult. And the archives were very unfriendly. So why wouldn't you go to Galicia? It makes perfect sense.
There is an amazing new book on Volhynia, interwar Volhynia, by Katrin Chancha. So she has done research in Ukraine, but it's still much better than some parts of today's Poland, where the archives were kept in Warsaw, and they are gone.
Mm. One thing that strikes me about your work when I read it is how much it reminds me of Eugen Weber's Peasants and the Frenchmen. I think it's because you have put so much effort into looking at relatively understudied archives to recreate the peasant world and how it becomes nationalized, and Weber does the same. I wonder if you could comment on how you think your work differs from Weber's. How is it similar? How is it different?
Well, I can see some similarities, and you're again very nice for telling me that, because that is a very flattering comparison between Weber and me, although it is also quite, in a sense, outdated. It is still a fascinating read. Obviously, it was also a trendsetter, like with this cliched expression of peasants into everything for decades. Like people who embarked on studying nationalization in this and that context, they were always like writing the history of peasants.
Actually, in my Slovakia book, I have a footnote where I say, Weber's title is very influential, for example, and then I just listed all the sources I could find, any book or any article or any book chapter where it's peasants into whatever. And then a scholar of Chinese history actually cited my book just for that footnote. So that footnote got me a citation from Gina Tam. But I interrupted you.
It is true. It also uses a very facile, like kind of, it has this idea of like his book. Certainly, we can agree on this. It is a history of successful national integration, and mine is a history of non-integration. But also the way he saw this nationalization problem has been overwritten by the last like 4 decades of research. So he saw it as more or less a kind of a one-way story, like peasants as simple vessels were filled up with modern ideas through various channels of modernization, and part of it is being Frenchmen. So and this is not the way we see it today. So
but it's also not the way it happened in our part of the world.
No, but he didn't credit those peasants with much agency. Not to mention, actually, that already at the time, Charles Tilly pointed out that he was also quite selective in his, like he went for the regions apparently that were the most backwards and the most out of the way. And actually, yes, so the situation was, so it didn't quite happen on. In that short time span as Weber described.
Well, I mean, I don't have a problem with him emphasizing the backwards areas because it makes his story the more dramatic. How did these backwards areas come to the modern world? Let's study that. Case study France. It's fantastic. I mean, I think
can generalize that.
Well, there's lots of things in Weber's story that don't generalize, but I think the basic story is peasants into nationalists. You have peasants and they don't have a national sense, as Weber very eloquently describes. And as Zahra has pointed out with her, by popularizing the phrase national indifference. I mean, in a lot of ways, Eastern European study has reinvented Eugen Weber's wheel by starting to study national indifference and people who are indifferent to national claims. Weber was a French historian. He was only thinking about France. And so he's imagining we have peasants and they enter modernity, and modernity is France. And maybe in the context of French historiography, that works. But when we have these competing national concepts in our part of the world, Frenchman equals modernity, it doesn't work the same way. You can't just say Romanian equals modernity, Hungarian equals modernity, German equals modernity. You have competing modernities and they fight with each other.
Yes, Weber was simply not interested in how far national consciousness is situational. So in what roles and what contexts and what domains of our lives is it actually relevant that we are national? Because he was studying in a sense one-dimensional context. So there were no competing offers. And so he could go with the assumption that those peasants became like Frenchmen, and in every moment of their life, and then they became kind of the same Frenchmen as the French intellectuals, like the ones who were producing nationalist discourse.
Yes, everyone became a mini Sartre, a mini Camus, smoking cigarettes at a cafe.
That is where I think this all this discussion of national indifference is very, very useful. Like it reminds of what Rogers Brubaker described, like how nationhood happens. So you need some long-term structural change in order for it to happen, but it doesn't happen all the time.
That's right. Well, we agree on Roger Brubaker being extremely useful. But if I could go back to one more contrast between your work and Weber's work. In Weber, the emergence of French, the transformation into Frenchmanness is a sort of a liberation. That it's a positive step. The peasants become modern, they enter the modern world. Isn't it wonderful? And the process of modernization in Weber's telling is essentially a success story. But much of the scholarly literature on modernization is a debate about how oppressive the Hungarian policies were. Some Hungarian scholars write apologia and say modernization is emancipatory and a liberation. But the Slovak, Romanian, Ukrainian scholars, by contrast, often paint the Hungarian regime and modernization as the blackest tyranny and this terrible, terrible yoke of oppression and so forth. So your work doesn't seem interested in that at all, but rather focuses on effectiveness. I wonder what you have to say about this.
Oh, that is quite a lot to unpack here, I think, because again, there are some things that I'm not, I can't go along with.
Well, contest my claim.
I'm interested in effectiveness, but the effectiveness of what? Because I think it is quite obvious that Magyarization, if you want to call it that was not a success story. So there were some pockets of populations who became Magyars in a sense, but it is quite controversial whether it had anything to do with these policies, whether it wasn't rather spontaneous, obviously. So well, a long side note on Magyarization then, because I have problems with this on multiple levels, although I use it all the time because I use it as a technical term. Like when you Magyarize your name from Schneider to Kovács, like that is obviously Magyarization, just technically. And the same Magyarization was also at work when they Magyarized the Valia Lunga to Bega Hosszú Patak. And then it is a Magyarization of something. And also we can describe this whole program ideology of dualist Hungarian state nationalism as a Magyarization, because that replicates the contemporary usage. The problem is that contemporary usage was ambiguous. So it could stand for so many things. And especially in retrospect, it becomes kind of a weasel word, sometimes an ideological cudgel. Like basically because that is that is a very appropriate term to retrospectively confuse designs, discourses with policies, with regulations, and those with outcomes. So sometimes you mentioned this. I don't think I have such a bad idea, but obviously those kinds of that kind of historiography was still mainstream, like Romanian or Slovak in the time of the national communist regime, so in the 1980s. Now I think the situation is much better. Probably it is still mired in ideological discourses, like framing this problem, but sometimes they actually implied that Magyarization was something that made Magyars on a mass basis. I don't know if you are familiar with that. There was an emigre millionaire called well, I think Josif Dragan or Konstantin Dragan, and he sponsored the publication of one late 19th century Hungarian guide for the name Magyarizer. He got it translated to all European languages, and he published it with a machine fabricating Magyars on the cover. It is quite complex, so let me unpack this. So originally there was a guy who himself Magyarized his name from something to Telkes, and he wrote a list of new Hungarian names that he just suggested people who are interested in Magyarizing their names. That was connected to this Magyarization as a social movement, which got many tens of thousands of people involved, Jewish and Christian, like German, like Gentile people of German backgrounds and also Slavic backgrounds. So there was this huge trend of Magyarizing their names. Now it already got this book already received kind of a twist when the Ministry of the Interior sent it out to the counties that kind of promoted the Magyarization of names. And it was a very thinly veiled kind of instruction for like the local administration to kind of try to push their underlings to Magyarize their names. So this is the first twist it receives. And then there is the second twist in a very adverse reading. It can actually become like, obviously, this guy who put out these translations didn't assume the effect was not in people actually reading it. So it didn't imply reading it, because if somebody read it, then the picture was quite different. But just putting out something like how to, I don't know what the title was, but a book that was an original document, so not a forgery, and just this framing with machine fabricating Magyar. So that is kind of a very dubious pedigree for the word Magyarization that it got after the fact, because at the time, like they were, like I think we can connect it to these debates that are going on about Russification, because the Russification is also a very contested term, and so now there is a strand of research that tries to extricate its various meanings, and they will talk about obrusenie, obrusevanie, so this kind of spontaneous, also the administrative aspect, and I think it can work very well also with respect to dualist Hungary, because they try to create a homogeneity to replace this diversity also of official practices. So in a sense, it also had its instrumental and symbolic sides, but it was in a way repainting the surface into Hungarian, and that was very important for the contemporaries. So the Magyar nationalists, that was important. That a foreigner who comes to Hungary has the sense that this is a Hungarian land, even if no foreigner would know Hungarian, but they noticed that the inscriptions are not in German and not in many languages, but they are in Hungarian. So that is a kind of that was one of the emphasis that they wanted out of this. And then there is also the imposition of Hungarianness, and then we can debate how far it was an assimilationist project, because I see it kind of a duplicitous, like a not entirely honest offer of modernization, if we can call it like that. Because what I see is that it was meant to be, and it was meant to be in a sense inefficient, and as long as it was inefficient, and people didn't actually, like kids, generations of kids didn't actually learn Hungarian, and it was even counterproductive, but it sustained this role of this Magyar supremacy that on the peripheries just meant the rule of the Magyar gentry.
I think it is important to think about how the meaning of Magyarization depends on where you go. I mean, if we talk about the desire to create millions of Magyars, if we buy the peasants into Magyars hypothesis, then, you know, in the Alföld, there's all sorts of Hungarian-speaking people who don't view themselves as Hungarian, particularly because they're nationally indifferent peasants. And then the Magyarization process turns them into Magyars. And hey, look at all the millions of Hungarians we've created. Magyarization is a great success. But then if we go to Transcarpathia, or we go to Romanian parts of Transylvania, then the whole purpose of Magyarization is to remind the bloody peasants that we Magyar aristocrats are on top, and don't you forget it. Mm-hmm. And there's no intention of trying to welcome them into the Hungarian community. The whole point is to reaffirm their subservience.
Yes, there is much symbolic violence involved, and in a sense, I see it more oppressive than assimilationist or Magyarizing, even, because obviously there, to some extent, it was a legitimizing ideology. It was also kind of about two minds about it, whether it was meant as assimilationist, but it oppressive, certainly it was.
Well, if we compare then the Magyarization policies in Transylvania to the Russification policies in Russia, or Germanization policies wherever, or to the Weberian model, but if we focus particularly on Transylvania, which you've spent so much of your career working on, what does it tell us about the unique nature of nationalism in Transylvania?
Probably it will tell us about the infrastructure, ethnic infrastructure, but I don't really think that, because it is again complex. If you want to draw a parallel with Russian policies, then within the Roman Empire, we have to make this twofold distinction between the territories that they consider to be Polish and the Western gubernias. So in Poland, I've just read a new German monograph on these Russian nationalist policies in the Vistula land, and it was quite obvious that even the state officials themselves distanced themselves from the idea of Russification, and they were pretending, and I think they were genuine about this, that when they didn't let school kids study, like schools to teach in Polish, they were actually containing Poles. So they were containing Polish nationalism. So they weren't trying to make Russians out of them, which would have been preposterous because they are Catholics. And so they were just implementing obviously very oppressive policy, but it was in order to contain them and not in order to turn them into anything. Whereas in the Western gubernias, they had the impression that that is disputed Russian space, and so then the thrust of these policies were to avoid Lithuanians, Belarusians, Ukrainians to turn into Poles. Because
well, it gets back to the question you mentioned earlier about the language dialect issue. You know, if you're Hungarians in Transylvania and the peasants speak Romanian, then you can't really say that Romanian is just sort of a dialect of Magyar, and we need to Magyarize them in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in Russia, if you look at a Ukrainian or Belarusian, you can say, it's just a dialect of Russian. Why don't we welcome them into the great Russian fold? But then if you think about the distance between two standard varieties, the difference between languages, you can reach these ambiguous cases. So I know from my own work on Pan-Slavism that there's plenty of people who saw Russian and Polish as the same language, because they saw Russian and Polish as dialects of Slavic. But you're saying that the Russians looked at Polish and they said, okay, these people cannot be won for the Russian nation any more than Romanian peasants can be run for the Hungarian nation. We have a Russification policy to keep them down rather than a Russification policy to assimilate.
That refers to the period after the second Polish uprising. I don't know which, because probably when you mentioned this, that there were people who thought the two languages were one, you are referring to an earlier period.
Well, it is true that I'm very unfashionable and that I'm interested in the 1830s and 1840s. You know, it seems to me that, you know, people say I'm interested in the Habsburg monarchy. It's always the 1890s, and nuts to the 1890s. 1830s is where it's at.
But it is fascinating that I also read books about Pan-Slavism. Pan-Slavism, like this intellectual trend fashionable with some Russian elites in the 1870s,
well,
let's say. And
the Pan-Slavism I'm interested in is not Russian expansionism. I'm interested in something else. I'm interested in the Habsburg Pan-Slavism that Jan Kolar promoted. And so that's a different thing altogether.
Yes, it is a different thing, but I want to relate to the letters, so to the Russians, and just want to mention that they would include everybody in the Pan-Slav fold, except for the Poles. So with the Czechs, it is not a problem that they are Catholics, because the other issue I see here, it is not that there are no dialect continua. So you can't pretend that any Romanian dialect is a dialect of Hungarian, although with mixture and hybridization, and actually framed as something like that is in between. So in this, so from the Transylvanian point of view, to the north west, you have this Satmar Szilágy area, and there you have lots of reflections on local Romanian dialect that would present them as some kind of a mixture, because they use so many Hungarian loanwords. But from a linguistic point of view, this is rubbish, obviously. But
I think we should be very careful about using the phrase "from a linguistic point of view." I found a quotation once by the American linguist Sapir, the famous Sapir of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that Sapir. And Sapir, his quotation is, so long as two languages have any relationship whatsoever, we are justified in calling the one the dialect of the other. So if you take that attitude, never mind Polish being a dialect of Russian or Russian and Polish being dialects of Slavic, like Russian and Polish can both be dialects of Welsh. I mean, we're all Indo-Europeans here. We can show that there's an Indo-European relationship. We're all just speaking dialects of Welsh. That's the linguistic point of view, according to Sapir.
Okay. I'm such old-fashioned that when I refer to linguistics, I actually have what I have in mind is this Saussurian Bloomfieldian linguistics.
Well, okay. It does seem to me there's a lot of linguists who say something like, well, from a linguistic point of view, X, and it's a way of trying to attack other linguists, because you can find plenty of linguists who say the opposite of X, whatever X is. But yeah, never mind that. Let's go on to your next work.
Let's get back to this, because you were inquiring about the nature of nationalism, and what I see specific to Transylvania, and that is something that it doesn't share with other very fashionable, like Transylvania is not fashionable, but there are some fashionable scenes and contexts that Habsburg historians study, where you don't have this, okay, you have non-related languages that are spoken next to each other, but usually you have a higher degree of bilingualism than in Transylvania, which was very asymmetrical. And so asymmetrical in the sense that Magyar peasants tended to speak Romanian, but it didn't work the other way around. And then you have confessional boundaries. So this combination and that overlap with this home language thing. Obviously, that is again not as clear-cut like this home language concept of home language, but I think if I want to name one thing that makes it quite unique, then it is this kind of structural infrastructure that made nationalism maybe more likely, more plausible than in other contexts, because you had so the terms had existed for centuries. Maybe not so much Magyar, to call somebody who is a Calvinist, but who is not a nobleman, Magyar, it was not entirely customary in the early modern period. But for Romanians like Vlach or Olah, it was quite obvious who they refer to when they refer to somebody of an Orthodox background and who speaks Romanian, because they were mostly monolingual. So I see a difference here, like in contrast to, let's say, Styria and local Slovene, German issues.
Well, I think the attention you want to pay to infrastructures and state structures, I understand, is guiding your current research about rural people's adherence to national movements. Is that your new research project? Can you tell us about that?
That is a prospective project, but we have to find funding for that. That would be focus on a connection that is much understudied and entirely out of fashion, probably, but that harks back to very old concerns from the side of Marxist historians about how this national mobilization could tap into social discontent. And in the 19th century, increasingly, what I see is that social gets equated with, these social contents very often can emerge in a state framework. So they, as if social grievances can go back to a state action, probably more than earlier, because there was this very intensive penetration of state structures that we can see very nicely in the second half of the 19th century. Like even if you look at how far taxes rose in that period, like several times in the span of a few decades. And that is true for the Kingdom of Hungary, but true also for other contexts. So there is this potential that states created by, let's call it that way, modernizing, but I would rather stick to this more technical description of state penetration. And then there is also one other aspect, another layer to it, is that this preemptive framing of discontent in ethnic terms. So, and that is again very, very conspicuous. If you just read how Hungarian state administrators, like senior, like on a ministerial level, were actually they were expecting this and that measure to trigger responses, and those responses they already kind of saw as inherently national, like national meaning minority nationalist. And that was a self-fulfilling prophecy. But what I see from the sources when you see any alignment with minority nationalist languages, minority nationalist contents, that is mostly when there is some provocation coming from the state, or something that they can relate to the state. So, but what I have been working so far, those were openly nationalizing state policies that did not necessarily provoke a response from the peasantry, but sometimes they did. So, and I was very interested in finding out what exact policies the peasants, like ordinary people, but in my context, those are mainly peasants, reacted to. And what I see is, for example, this renaming policies can to sometimes they leave ordinary people entirely indifferent. So they will just laugh at it because it doesn't interfere with their lives. But when they themselves in the papers are referred to an entirely new name that they can't even recognize themselves, the way the state deigns to keep track of them, like that is another issue altogether. And I didn't include this in my book, but there is some evidence that this is something that at rallies, for example, people resonated with as a grievance. And also, like there was this campaign of renaming localities, and then two-thirds of the local governments protested. And that is another issue altogether, that sometimes it is quite funny that they try to make use of nationalist language, like minority nationalist language, and they are not up to the task, simply. So then it is just an when it comes as an unanticipated challenge, then they can't just come up with an entirely consistent nationalist response. It
is a mistake to assume that nationalists will be internally consistent.
Even elite nationalists. But then John Breuer writes about popular nationalism, and he focuses on Western Europe, but he describes this very ambiguous relationship with the masses and the nationalizing elites, and sometimes it is a mutual kind of duping, so to say.
Yes. Well, I think we are running out of time. So as a final question, where can people go to learn more about this topic?
Oh, you mean 19th century Hungarian nation building or Transylvania?
I was thinking about nation building generally, but I suppose you can interpret the question as you like.
But isn't the whole series supposed to be about nation building? Well, I think that you already mentioned that when we speak about dualist Hungary, then many of probably the first results that on Google that you will find, especially if the books are quite old, then you can assume that they are at least somewhat propagandistic. But in the last 10-20 years, there has been like a burst of new literature that is worth reading, I think, in major languages. And you are more fortunate if you read German. Probably there are more good books in German. But what I would suggest to get a sense of this pageantry of Hungarian nationalism triumphant, and also its discontent, is Bálint Varga's book on the monumental nation, which came out in Berghahn. It is actually in the same series as my second book. There are books by Robert Nemes. There is a fascinating new book by Thomas Lorman on the Slovak Catholic movement, and that is obviously, it was born out of the Hungarian Christian socialist movement, and then became just a splinter group. So this Hlinka and company. But I think it also gives a very good, like the first part of the book that takes place in dualist Hungary. It will also give you a very good sense of these nation building policies, and also the system of surveillance because it describes how the Slovak Catholics tried to create their own network of associations, and how the Hungarian state tried to undermine this, but there were also limits to what they could do. Yes, actually, talking about Transylvania, there is a Keith Hitchens. I think it is quite relevant and good. It is another question how easy to source his book on the Romanian national movement is, but it is a solid scholarship. And yes, we can't ignore Rogers Brubaker and their book on Cluj Kolozsvár. Probably that is a must. And speaking about Transylvania, also Sorin Mitus' book on the early generation of Romanian nationalists in Transylvania. That is quite an old book, but a very good one.
Well, there's a lot of food for thought there. Well, I've been Alexander Maxwell, and this has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you for your time, and I hope we'll see you again.
We are at, how long has it been?
We've been talking for an hour and 2 minutes, but I think there's a little bit that's recording. I think you should stop the recording now.
Oh.